All right, our last video for this section is sort of some cleaning up of some different principles. So let's say we've got this rotated all kinds of different ways and moved around and scaled X and all kinds of weird things. Last video, we already went over how to use the transform shelf to reset these. But there's also a keyboard shortcut to do that. So the Alt key, will basically act as like an undo or an invert for whatever the next key is that you press. So if G is grabbing, if I hit Alt G, it goes back to the middle of that center. If S is scaling, if I hit Alt S, it scales it back to its original default position. And if I rotated it in some weird ways, if I hit Alt R, it goes back to its default rotation position. So every primitive object that you have in your scene has a default position, location, and rotation. That's determined by however it looks when you first put it on the screen. So being able to reset it to those positions is really important. Understanding the distinction between transformations to the primitive object and the mesh is really going to be important in the next module. So just know how to get it back to those original states. If you have multiple objects on the scene, so let's go ahead and add another cube, and then let's add a UV sphere, ooh, different objects. And let's add Suzanne, who's the monkey. We'll learn about Suzanne later on. If you have a whole bunch of objects on the scene, sometimes it can just get overwhelming trying to keep track of them. So I'm going to go hide those shelves. And you can change the size of these panels by clicking and dragging right on that line. If you get this line with double arrows, you can change how much of those different windows you see. So at the very first video I was showing you that you can shy different objects from the scene by clicking on the eyeballs, just like in Photoshop or other Adobe Suite software. However, that actually doesn't shy them from your render. So if I go to my camera view, here actually let's move Suzanne up here and this guy up in here. If I shy them from here, they're still going to render out. We're going to do that in a minute. So if I want to shy it from the rendering, I have to click on the render icons. If you don't want to shy it, but you don't want to accidentally click it, you can click on these arrows, and then let's see, what can I actually select right now? So right now Suzanne is the only object in here that I can really select, and I can move her around. So this is helpful if you have a lot of objects in the scene and you keep accidentally clicking one. You can just click on those selection arrows to shy the ability to actually select them. The next thing that's useful in organization is thinking about layers. Now, I almost never use layers unless I'm animating, but it's important to understand how layers function in Blender pretty early on. So these widgets down here are actually your layers. They don't look like much, but they are. To move an object to different layers, there's a couple different ways. The easiest is to hit M. And so I have Suzanne selected right now. As soon as I move my cursor, the M goes away. But if I hit M, this shows me that she's on this very first layer. They're not numbered or anything like that. This is just how many layers you have. So if I want to actually move her to a different layer, I can just click on one of these widgets. And she disappears from this scene. And now she's on this totally other layer all by herself. And you can see that there's an object on the layer because there's a little dot on it. Now, let's say I want her to be on this layer and on her own layer. Just, let's say I want to do something with her and I don't want to be distracted by other things, but I do want her to be in this layer and this is the layer I want to render. Well, I can go back and grab her and hit M again. And if I hold down the Shift key, I can put her on multiple layers. I could even have her on a whole bunch of layers. So now she's on these other layers all by herself, but back on this first layer, she's still in here also. So that's just a useful thing to know about. Again, if I want to get rid of her from other layers, I can hit M and then Shift Select to put her back on that initial layer. So that's how layers work. Now, if you have an extended keyboard and you didn't set your preferences, if you hit the numbers, they'll actually go to the different layers. So it's layer 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's one of the reasons why we set it up in that very first video. The last thing to think about is saving and rendering. So to save this file, we've been moving around and doing lots of stuff in here, but we haven't actually saved anything yet. So I'm going to go to File and Save As. It's Shift-Command-S, which is the same as a lot of other Adobe software. And if you're a Mac user, this might look a little scary because it's more like a Windows interface, but it's not bad. So here, if you have any system bookmarks, it shows you where everything is, or you can go to your system and hunt down things. I like to make a new folder for all my projects, so I'm going to go to my desktop. I have a whole bunch of stuff on here. I'm just going to go ahead and make a new folder with this widget right here. Oh, there it actually sorry, it shows the folders. I'm going to make a new folder with this icon. And I'm going to call it Blender Module 1, just to stay organized. And then I can click inside that folder, and I'll save this, and I'll call this Navigation Studies. Now, best practices for this semester. Because because Canvas doesn't always associate your name with files, it's a really good idea to put your last name as the first word in your file names. That way, if for some reason everybody's files doesn't get renamed when they're uploaded to Canvas, I'll know whose files belong to whom. So this is best practices. It's also best practices when you're working on internships or anything like that, so that people can identify who created what files. And then I'll say, just got nudged over a little bit, save as Blender file. And now this file is saved. Now, rendering. In your properties panel, so okay, I know it's a little confusing, but this is your properties shelf and this is your properties panel. In this very first tab, these are different tabs, there's a button called Render. We're going to get into the Render button a little bit more in the next video, but go ahead and just click Render. And this shows us what a render of our scene will look like. So it's pretty different lighting-wise, and we're going to learn about that a little bit more later on. If you want to save a render, let me fix this. You go to Image, down here at the bottom, Save as Image, and it's going to save in my Blender Module 1 folder. So I'll call this Navigation. Actually, I'm going to call it Freeman Navigation, Best Practices. And you'll notice it's a PNG file. And again, we'll get into the settings a little bit later on. And now, if I go to that folder, if I can find it, there's that PNG. And I can open that up and preview or email it. So that's the basics of navigating inside of Blender. And the next page, we're actually going to start